also, okay, and your organization is hosting the spring meeting as well, remotely, however, I gather, right?
Correct.
So, yeah, you know, that's probably the best thing to do under the circumstances. I think all of us look forward to having an in-person annual meeting, spring meeting someday, but maybe it isn't going to be this time. You know, it's been a long, what, 2 years with COVID affecting everything. But, you know, I think one good spin-off is that, you know, Zoom meetings are here to stay. And I think it's a really great way to get together. So I'm going to go ahead and run my PowerPoint here. Can you see that okay? Can you see my PowerPoint stream?
Yes.
Is it okay to run? Okay, Phil. Let me know if you can't see it. Okay, here we go.
Yeah, we can see it. Thank you.
Okay, good. Okay, well, I'm going to introduce you to the general area of what we call the Middle Rio Grande region, which not everybody is familiar with. And I think one reason why that's true is that many of the archaeological resources have been essentially obliterated in the Middle Rio Grande. A lot of archaeologists know about the Northern Rio Grande, and rightly so, an incredible area. But in the Albuquerque Basin, so much archaeology has been basically wiped out that I think many folks don't realize what was here and the little bit that is still here now, today. So geographically, we call the Middle Rio Grande region basically from Bernalillo up here down to about Bernardo, which is down in here. It's a poorly defined southern boundary. The Rio Medio, or Middle Rio Grande, is also an overlapping term. The Spanish referred to it as the Tiwa or Tiwish province. Why? Because the native Pueblos spoke the Tiwa language. South of that, it's south of the Tiwa district to the north, and it's north of the Piro district to the south, if that makes sense. So in general, it's the area that you see right here. Okay. You guys have all memorized this kind of a chart, so I won't spend a long time on it. We have the Pecos classification, you know, which has been around for a long time, since Alfred Vincent Kidder. Basket Maker 2, 3, Pueblo 1, 2, 3. It was very nice of everybody to change routinely by 200-year increments, don't you think? Then Wendorf and Reed in 1955 came along with an alternative classification, which I'm not sure was better, but it's often used in this area. And so this shows the correlation of the two. It was a long developmental period. Coalition, which is basically P3, and Classic, which is almost identical to Pueblo 4 in the Pecos classification. And it's this period of time up to the basically 1680 Pueblo revolt, from 1300 to about 1680 is the time period that we're talking about here at Kuaua Pueblo. In other words, it's one of the very large and probably the best preserved of the classic or P4 Pueblos in the Rio Grande Basin. One of the very few that still exists that you can actually go visit. All these little red dots show you from the arms files the density of sites in the northern part of Albuquerque. And I'm just showing this to you to impress you with the fact that there are probably thousands, or were, of Pueblo sites of various ages, all up and down the river. This is the Sandia Reservation. Oops, Kuaua is about up here. And many of these sites are known. Some of them have been excavated over the years. And many of them, of course, don't actually exist as visitable sites any longer. They're under developments and power lines and such. This is the southern Albuquerque Basin. You can see Albuquerque here, and now we're going somewhat to the south. Again, showing a very high density of archaeological sites of different ages. These are the ones that have actually been recorded as LA numbers in the arms sites. Notice the high density along Tijeras Arroyo. I live somewhere up in here. Tijeras Pueblo, one of the few existing sites that you can still visit, is about right in here. And Tijeras Arroyo had many other sites along its boundaries, along the water course on the side of it. The confluence with the Rio Grande is about right down in here. This is a schematic picture done by my friend Mike Marshall that gives the location and some of the names of and the LA numbers of some of the most famous ones that we know about. Here's Kuaua, the one we're going to talk about a little bit more. LA 187, which is, well, you know where Bernalillo is. It's right on the outskirts of Bernalillo. I can't see your hands, but raise your hand if you've been to the ruins of Kuaua. Probably Cheryl has. Right. The Jemez River comes in here. And this is really kind of the northern edge of the middle Rio Grande area. But look at all of the others that Mike Marshall has put on this map. I've worked at Chamizal Pueblo. I've done ceramics from the Man site. I've done ceramics from well, from several of these in here. They're not all on this map, but this is a very good rendition of the prehistoric only and the prehistoric and pre-revolt sites of the major ones that we know about along the Rio Grande. I've also analyzed ceramics from Tijeras Pueblo, which is off the map here. A densely populated area. Okay, now focusing on the ruins at Kuaua today, they are housed in the Coronado State Historic Site. Many of you have probably stopped there. It's right on the edge of Bernalillo on 550 as it goes out of town, a fairly densely populated area now. And this is what the ruins look like today. There's a parking lot, if you can see the tiny little cars there. And the site has a large museum area and a house that was plopped down in the 1930s, taking out part of the ruin so that the caretakers and the rangers who were in charge of the site could live there. Something we would not do today. As you can see, just from the aerial view, there are several plazas with kivas in them. Not all of it has been excavated. This is called the South Plaza. This is the North Plaza, and there's an East Plaza, which is not as well known and essentially unexcavated area. So there are at least 3 plazas, and I'll talk about these and their ceramic contents in a little bit, because looking ahead, essentially they were constructed in that order. This was the first area built, and overlapping in time. I'm not saying that one was abandoned, but then the North Plaza was occupied, and the East apparently last and possibly never even finished by the original inhabitants. Here's an aerial picture of Kuaua about 1940. here you see the museum area, which is that. And this is the house for the ranger, which is that. And you can see all of these excavated rooms. Well, they did something that probably wouldn't be done today, at least hopefully wouldn't. There was a commemoration ceremony for the 400th anniversary of Coronado's arrival. And we know that Coronado's party spent one winter, probably 2 winters, very near to here along the river. And in celebration of that, in 1938 and 39, they excavated essentially every room that they could identify so that they would have something to show the public and the dignitaries when they came to have the big celebration for 400th Coronado. This seems really out of place and not appropriate today. And the really bad thing about this is that they ripped open most of these rooms, which are not beautiful sandstone as you have in Chaco Canyon. It's all made of adobe. And what happens to adobe when you expose it to the elements? It erodes rapidly. And so the site doesn't even look like this today. Many of these have returned to mounds. Some of them have been stabilized, but it's in retrospect a shame that this kind of rapid excavation took place. The only good thing I can say is that we have ceramic and other artifact collections in the museum in Santa Fe and some of them in the Maxwell Museum in Albuquerque, which were removed in the process of this excavation. And they still remain to be analyzed. So there is something to be said, at least for the preservation of artifact collections after all the ripping and tearing occurred. Here's another photograph taken in, we think, 1940. There's the Rio Grande. Again, the museum, caretaker's house. The parking lot is over here, now paved. If you've been to the site, this is where you would park and then you would walk into the grounds here. There's now a much modern, there's a nice restroom where that house is. So it doesn't look exactly the same, but it again gives you an idea of how much rampant excavation took place in the South Plaza, North Plaza, and the East area. Another nearby site, which is essentially completely removed now, and a concrete plant sits on top of it, was called Santiago Pueblo, also known as Bandelier's Poirai. It's LA 326. And it was excavated partially in the 1930s. Kurt Schaafsma gave me this picture, aerial picture taken in the 1930s. These rooms were opened up, and I think the collections are in Santa Fe or in Albuquerque, and to my knowledge have never been studied. So there's a big opportunity for artifact analysis of the material that came from these two sites. Where are we digging these days, folks? We're digging in museums, and rightly so. Just as an aside, Clay Mathers, a couple of years ago, did metal detection around the outside of Kuaua Pueblo because of the proximity of the encampment of Coronado's party in 1540-41. And indeed, he came up with a lot of metal items. These are actually from LA 290, not from Kuaua, but the Spanish expedition also attacked both of these pueblos, and these are similar artifacts from LA 290, which is a little farther south on the Rio Grande. Mathers has discovered similar Spanish period items, which are datable to that period of Coronado's encampment there, probably during 2 winters. So we have that whole aspect as well. Pueblo 4 or classic petroglyphs are found in many areas. You've probably been to Petroglyph Park, a city park on the west side of Albuquerque, which has preserved many of the petroglyphs of the same period and same culture. Here's a horned serpent, not a feathered serpent, by the way, it's a horned serpent. And here's a warrior with a shield and a spear. And this guy is probably a space alien, for all we know. Okay, we're not going to have pottery class here, but I just wanted to show you some typical examples of the classic period P4 glazeware that was popular and was made at Kuaua and in many of the other sites around it. As you probably know, the glazes are classified into A, B, C, D, E, F. And so just some examples. Here's a glaze A bowl from Hayward Pueblo in Tijeras Canyon. Here is a glaze C bowl. That illustration comes from Dean Wilson's website, which is very useful. I know Dean Wilson pretty well. And here's a glaze D bowl, which actually was excavated at Kuaua. Although these are geometric shapes, you can see the general progression of a very tight geometric design early to a looser, less formal one, often with representations of actual humans or probably parrots or macaws, as you see this stylized one here, with a beak and presumably feathers there. And if you use your imagination, even this little motif may represent that. The painting became more free form and eventually actually quite sloppy by the time we got to the latest ones, E and F. These are pots that are in the museum there. You can go see them through the glass. And these are later, these are E and F. And you can see again the stylized parrot or beak form, often red frets surrounded by, this is the black glaze paint. The paint had lead in it, and which probably came from the Surios Hills, we think. And when it was fired, the lead turns into a vitreous glass. This is a jar from, they're not easily typed, but probably late jar time period. Okay, now we're going to go back to the excavation that was done and the ceramic analysis that we accomplished on that fairly recently. Here again, we have three main plazas, the south, the north, and the east. There's a mixture of round kivas and square kivas at Kuaua. And I'm not sure they're well enough dated to say whether the round ones were earlier, although because there are very few absolute dates, chronometric dates from this site. That's one reason why we rely so heavily on ceramics. My feeling is that the circular kivas probably are the earlier of the two, and the North Plaza, which we know is constructed somewhat afterwards, has only one square kiva, and the latest one also has a square kiva. So I think there is a progression there, but it's not totally proven. We don't know how many rooms there were originally. Adobe architecture is difficult to deal with, and again, having excavated so much of it and having a lot of it eroded at this time, it's hard to get an accurate floor count. If you go to Chaco Canyon, you see some really beautiful architecture, but I'm sorry, folks, that's not what we're dealing with here. Eroded adobe just doesn't last very well. But the estimate is that there were some 900 ground floor rooms, and at least some of the Pueblo was two-story. And if you want to project from 900 definite and add a little bit more, there were probably 1,000 to 1,100 rooms in all, if you include first and second stories. This was a very big village. the excavation that produced the ceramics that I'm talking about here took place in 2017. And these are test units. There was no excavation actually within the Pueblo, but the purpose of this project, which was organized by Matt Barber and Ethan Ortega, was to go around the edge of the site and test with 1 meter test pits to see what the depth of the deposits were outside of the boundaries of the site, and also laterally to see how far away artifact materials were spread away from the actual boundary of the site. So there was no actual excavation inside, but the debris thrown out or discards from these areas presumably rested in these adjacent marginal areas and was picked up in these test units. So again, the purpose of the 2017 testing project was to collect the first complete unbiased artifact sample. All of it was screened 100% for artifacts and environmental data. And of course, that includes more than pottery. To my knowledge, the lithics, botanical and so forth have not been analyzed yet, but we did the pottery at least. 2, examine the spatial extent of artifact outside walls and around the site perimeter. 3, sample separately the areas of occupation, the south, the north, and the east plazas, and to obtain datable materials. There are only 2 absolute dates reported in print, and they're both 1397 ring dates from the South Plaza. That fits pretty well. That puts him in the early classic. But we know that, of course, it lasted longer than that. After all, there were people living there when Coronado arrived and left artifacts surrounding that, as Clay Mathers has now proven. So essentially, we assumed that people were living there for basically at least 300 years. It would be nice to obtain additional absolute dates in the future to verify what we've interpreted mostly from ceramic data. Here's some pictures of the crews that were actually doing the testing. These are test pits covered over right now by tarps. And you can see that they're being excavated. They went clear to sterile, I think, in all of these pits, and they're around the outside edges of the site walls. I should also mention that unlike many prehistoric pueblos, there is no big stratigraphic mound full of refuse as we would like to have archaeologically. I believe that if there ever had been a midden of refuse material, it's been washed away by the river, which is about 10 feet behind us here. Either that or the inhabitants basically tossed things in the river and didn't accumulate a large trash midden. In either case, archaeologists would like to have a nice buildup, of course, of accumulated trash, which happens some places, but not here at Kuaua. So we don't have a lot of stratigraphic information. If there were any, they've been eroded in the past. Here are some potsherds that came from the testing. These are glaze A, and you saw some hole vessels a few minutes ago. These are intermediate glazes, in other words, glaze C and D going on in time. And this is later glazes of E and F. I want you to look at the potsherd here if you can see it. Is it my imagination, or does this look like a horse? Looks like a horse. Looks like an Appaloosa horse. Look, it's got spots. Well, if that's the case, that might have been a pot that was manufactured when the Spanish were there, i.e. in the 1600s. Because we know it's late. It's probably glaze E or F. But Who knows? Here is a picture of our crew. We had a volunteer crew, very well trained, and we went through the large collection as it came in from the field, and we're sorting the sherds by pottery type here in the lab. That's yours truly looking over. The pottery crew was excellent in helping us sort the ceramics and type them, because it was a large collection of material. I'm very indebted to their hard work. Okay, I don't know if you can see this chart, but this shows the types of pottery and the dates that have been assigned to them more or less accurately in the general Rio Grande area. Glaze A, and these are the actual types of glaze A: Agua Fria, San Clemente, Cienaguilla. Glaze B, more types: glaze C, D, E, and F. These are the latest ones, going clear up to essentially the Pueblo Revolt. We think that Kuaua was abandoned during the Pueblo Revolt and was not occupied by Pueblo people after that. That's true of many of these sites, where the Pueblo Revolt, of course, was such an incredibly disruptive episode in Pueblo prehistory that essentially many of these sites, the majority of them, certainly in the middle Rio Grande, were never reoccupied after that. Whether the population ever even returned after fleeing the middle Rio Grande area is questionable. Many of them probably ended up at Hopi and Acoma and other places and never returned to the area. It was a total disaster. These are bowl rims. The series is based on a series of rim forms, which I won't get into, that were worked out by Harry Mara. And so we like to use the rims, which are very diagnostic, the changes in the rim forms, to identify those sherds. However, all is not lost with the other sherds that we find, because the glazeware body sherds can at least be identified more generally to early, middle, and late, early, intermediate, and late. And these will give us a much larger sample, since they do not rely on just bowl rims, but rather on general designs and shape characteristics that at least we can get some chronological information out of, instead of relying solely on the bowl rims themselves. We have jars, but most of the glazewares actually were in bulk form. We also have a few, but not many, pieces of pottery that came from other areas. There's some Hopi area polychrome, Jedito or Sitkiaki. There's some black and white mineral painted stuff that we don't know where it came from. And we have Biscuit A and Biscuit B from the Pajarito Plateau. If you go up there and visit Bandelier Monument, that's where they were making that stuff. And of course we have mountains of utility ware, gray ware, cooking ware, right? Corrugated pottery with exposed coils around the outside gave way after a while, probably around 1450 or 1500, to plain surfaced utility. And so the corrugations basically disappeared, and all you had was a large plain gray cooking jar. There's even a little bit of micaceous and a little bit of Corona corrugated. It's interesting that even utility ware traveled sometimes, and we get some evidence of transportation of corrugated or utility wares that probably were carrying liquids, possibly. Here are the ceramic type frequencies from the site. And you can see that the counts here of the bowl rims are not high, simply because that's the quandary we get ourselves into, that there are not that many of them, but these are the most accurate ones. And you can certainly see that the site of Kuaua, based on the bowl rims, was occupied continuously all the way through from glaze A through glaze F. That in itself is something new because we don't yet have the chronological absolute dates to verify that. But that was a nice piece of information that suggested that Kuaua was never probably really abandoned any time during the classic period for almost 300 years. One thing we did notice is that the amount of glaze F is during the Spanish occupation of the area, basically starting in 1600 and going to the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. The amount of glaze F is small. I think that relates to the poor condition of the folks in the area during the Spanish occupation. Diseases were spreading rapidly. And the amount of pottery produced in glaze F is always small in every one of the sites that we've looked at, implying that the number of potters was few and the number of pots produced was smaller than in earlier times. I think it's an indication of a society under stress. The more generic early, intermediate, and late, of course, we have much higher samples, and they show essentially the same thing, that Kuaua was undoubtedly occupied all the way from about 1325 in glaze A, all the way up through the late glazes continuously. We see no evidence of a gap in time. Here again, we have a few intrusives by trade, although in fact, not that many. We have only one Hopi sherd. We have some mineral painted types that came from elsewhere, and we have from the Pajarito Plateau, a little bit of what we call biscuitware, abique and bandolier, black on white right here, but only 5 sherds. Surprisingly little intrusive wear and massively local material, or at least local within the Middle Rio Grande, if not Kuaua itself. Okay, so of the 1,051 painted pieces, all were Rio Grande glazer except 9. As I just mentioned, these were Jejito Sikyaki and biscuitware from the Bandolier Pajarito Plateau. But what is really important is the entire Rio Grande glazeware sequence is there from glaze F through glaze, excuse me, glaze A through glaze F. And we believe that from that, the site was continuously occupied throughout the classic period. So glazeware is present from 1300-ish, 1325 at least, to the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. That's a long occupation and apparently a continuous one. And within that time, the early glazes are probably the most common, it looks like, followed by intermediate and then late glaze types. As I just mentioned, the paucity and lack of late glaze E and glaze F pottery at the site kind of implies a decline in population, or certainly a decline in the production of glazeware pottery. I think it was a very stressful period which resulted in that. We also have, as I mentioned, imports of ceramics from the outside of the glazeware region, biscuitware and Hopi wares, but in fact, they're relatively minor. This shows the early, intermediate, and late glazes as a pie chart. The last table that I'll bore you with is one that shows what is happening around the site. The South Plaza south side, if you remember the picture, the South Plaza west side, the North Plaza west side, North Plaza north side, and the North Plaza the northeast side. In other words, going around the site on the periphery, basically clockwise. So I don't know if you can see this up here. I'm having a little trouble in looking at the definitions up here. But essentially, what we see is that there was a progression around the site of pottery of the time sequence A through F, where it's more popular, and I'm sorry, it's not easy to show that right here. The pottery type frequencies do show the same progression as we mentioned over here. So that goes along with what we already believed about the construction sequence at Kuaua, and the fact that the three main plazas were constructed in the order south, north, and east. Although it doesn't imply that one was abandoned when the other was constructed. And in fact, the biggest plaza, the first one, the South Plaza, may have been continuously occupied throughout the sequence, being the longest lived of any of them. This is a little bit easier to see. This is the same data that you saw in the last table. This shows the groups around the site and the amount of glaze AB, CD, and EF. So these are early, intermediate, and late glazes, and very strong early in the South Plaza. As we move around the site, the South Plaza on the west side, the amounts are different, but we're looking at the relative amounts here, the percentages. There's still a lot of glaze A. By the time we get to the North Plaza on the west side, again, imagining we're going around the site, relatively speaking, the amount of early glazes, glaze A and B, has dropped. Whereas the intermediate glazes and now the late glazes are coming up considerably. So there's definitely a progression as we move around. The last two, the numbers are lower because of the sample size, which was not as large as I would hope, but you can't do anything about that. What you see is what you get, right? So, but if you look at the relative amounts, the early glazes are very few, and the assemblages are percentage-wise much heavier dominated with CD and EF compared to the early glazes. So I think this definitely shows a progression of occupation around the site, but it does not prove that the earlier plazas were necessarily abandoned while later ones were constructed. In fact, it may, in general, show an expansion of the population through time and the construction of new parts of the site while earlier ones were still in existence. That often happens in historic pueblos, such as Acoma. So to wrap this up, the conclusions we got from the 2017 testing are: the ceramics are abundant in all areas of the site. Every test unit had multiple potsherds all the way down to sterile soil. So there's a lot of deposition there. The pottery types are, as we thought, almost entirely Rio Grande glazeware, which is typical for this region in time. The range of dates spans the entire glazeware series from 1300 to the revolt of 1680. So Kuaua was occupied for at least 300 plus years continuously. The quantities of the early glazes are more than the intermediate and late glazes. Does that mean that there was a population decline later on? Possibly. I think we need more evidence of this, and we don't have any collections from the east part, the northeast part of the site, which has never been excavated. So I don't think we have the complete story, but there is a suggestion of population decline, particularly during the period of 1600 to 1680, when there was close proximity to a continuous Spanish occupation of the area, where estancias and haciendas were constructed in the area close by, we know that, and the population of the pueblos was severely affected by that. Finally, the frequencies around the outside change pretty definitely from the south to the north to the east, as we've said. And these units were undoubtedly built and probably occupied in that sequence. Were the old room blocks abandoned as the village grew? We don't know for sure. If you visit Coronado State Historic Site, it's a beautiful place. One of the really nice things about it is it's right along the Rio Grande in an area which has not been built upon. It's really a natural bosque, if you want to call it that. The river is flowing close by, and there are a lot of birds. If you want to go bird watching, it's a great place. And what you're looking at here is a view from the museum steps, looking across the river to the Sandia Mountains in the background. If you haven't been there, it's worth stopping, and I highly recommend it. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Franklin. That was great. That's a really interesting area. Let me go to
You have some questions?
full screen. Does anybody have any questions for Dr. Franklin? There is one in the chat about temper variability.
Okay.
Let me see if I can get that up. You can go ahead and stop sharing your screen, and then we can get everybody on your.
Okay. I'm going to hit stop share here.
Yeah.
There we go.
Okay.
Hi, everybody.
Yeah. Hi. Let's see. See if I can get it.
I know some of you folks.
Yeah.
Mark Henderson.
Anyway, the question in the chat says, let's see. Well, let's go with this one. What is the evidence of the river changing courses during these periods?
I can't tell you directly. I think that would take a geologist. The general pattern of the Rio Grande, of course, is that it's a meandering stream, and obviously has changed its course in some respects, even in historic times. And nowadays we have dams upstream, as you know, on the Rio Grande, which prevent it from flooding. But back even in the early part of the 1900s, 1920s, 1930s, there were major floods with the Rio Grande going up over its banks. There are pictures of downtown Albuquerque underwater because of the flooding of the Rio, which doesn't happen anymore. And I think that undoubtedly that probably has had a detrimental effect on the ruins, which, if you've been there, as you saw from the last picture, are very close to the margin of the river. If that river came up 10 feet, it would be up against the ruins. I also suspect that if there was any sort of a midden accumulation of trash, that the river would have taken that out as well. Either that, or folks just disposed of trash directly in the water, which would be a sanitary thing to do, I suppose, and which is a reason why we don't have a nice trash mound. So I'm not a hydrologist, but that's basically the situation. What we see today with the Rio Grande is not the way it used to be.
Yeah, I have a related question to that while you're on it, about the flow. Has anyone done any kind of studies in that area about what the flow rate would have been before all the irrigation and everything in Colorado?
Well, again, I think, there are geologists and hydrologists that can answer your questions about the river better than I can. But most of these sites that we know about that I showed on the map earlier are in the Rio Grande floodplain or just above it. I mean, I think it's safe to say that if the river came up 10 or 12 feet, that most of these sites, well, they wouldn't have been inundated, but they would be getting wet because this stuff, like the big sites in Egypt, were right down on the floodplain, which is a great place to grow crops, right? Your corn, beans, and squash, and even with some probable irrigation by means of canals, was a great place to grow crops, but it wasn't a great place to be in the springtime when all of the river came down from melting snow up in Taos and raised the level of the river by 5 or 10 feet.
Yeah, right. They estimate the river in Taos probably had 10 times more water than it has now. Just from all of that flow and, changes over the years. But yeah, so here's another question about ceramics. It says, did you analyze any of the ceramics regarding temper variability? Do you think
Yes.
most of the glaze wares were
Yeah.
at Kuaua?
Yeah. That didn't come up in the talk. We were just concentrating on the time periods, glaze A, B, C, D, etc. But since then, I've looked at a big sample of this pottery for temper. In order to do that, you have to take a section of it and you have to look at it under a microscope. Ideally, petrographic thin sections would be even better, but we haven't used that technique yet. I have a paper that's going to come out in Pottery Southwest pretty soon, in which I discuss the paste, the temper, and where people were able to actually collect those materials in the vicinity of Kuaua, because I did quite a lot of glumphing around and looking at geologic maps. So I think I have a pretty good idea of where they were obtaining their clays and their tempers. The clays essentially came from the river bank. They match very nicely. The tempering material is almost entirely basalt, and there are basalt cliffs in the vicinity within 2 miles. And I'm pretty certain that these folks were not tempering their material, their ceramics, with just river sand, which is actually not a very good tempering material because it doesn't bind well. But in fact, they had very specific ideas of what they wanted to use, and they were willing to go to sources a couple of miles or farther away to obtain basalt and other igneous rocks from the volcanic flows that are nearby. And these make much better tempering materials because they bind nicely with the clay and make a much harder vessel wall. So more about that later. We're working on it.
Yeah, and you mentioned the lead probably came from Cerrillos. There are a lot of lead glaze wares up there. But there's no closer source of lead that they could have used.
No, but archaeologists have studied the glaze paint composition for many years, and there's a lot of information about that. And from what we know, the Cerrillos Hills sources were the predominant ones that were used for lead. In other words, they would go up there, and in fact, we even know some of the collection areas, apparently some of the places where mining was done prehistorically, and galena ore was mined out. It was pulverized. It was mixed with a binder, because you can't just paint lead on a pot. You have to process it. It has to be powderized and then mixed probably with a guaco, a paint medium that is liquid, and you paint it on there, and then you fire it up, and the liquid burns out, and what you're left with is a nice shiny line, which is the lead. So that's basically the process. And there's been quite a lot of research on the trade and mining of this material. The bottom line is that this stuff got all over the place throughout the entire Middle Rio Grande and farther down. That either the raw material as galena or the processed pigment was traded to very many sites, because there are only a very few places where you can actually obtain the raw lead material. It's interesting stuff. A lot is known about that.
So it's kind of a smelting process that the Spanish would have done something about that when they got here.
Well, that's another aspect to the story. At some sites, such as Paaco up here closer to me, the Spanish actually had smelter installations, and whether that lead was able to fall into the hands of potters, we're not sure. There are different opinions about whether the mines and the smelters were closed to Pueblo usage or whether they were allowed to continue participating. But of course, that was only after 1600. That was only very late. The Pueblo mining of lead ores had gone on for 300 years before that.
Right. Yeah.
So yeah, it's
I had another
interesting process.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned
I have had a question before that I don't know whether you're interested in, but the question has come up whether lead, which is poisonous, as you know, got into the food that the Pueblo people ate from these vessels, and the answer is essentially no. For one thing, the lead glazed paint only covers a very small portion of the surface. Another thing is that these were serving vessels, not cooking vessels. The cooking was done undoubtedly in utility pots, jars over the fire, and those didn't have any lead on them. And furthermore, there's actually one instance where people, modern archaeologists have tested bone material. This was from a site not too far from me at San Antonio, LA 24. And the test for lead was negative on the osteological material, showing that lead had not appreciably entered the skeletal material of the inhabitants there. So although it sounds like this could have been a problem for them, and indeed, modern, some Mexican pottery that is overall glazed, can provide, unfortunately, some lead if you heat it. But the prehistoric glazewares didn't have a problem as far as the population was concerned, apparently. So.
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, it's interesting. There's a question about migration, whether the Kuaua people had come from the north, from earlier groups, or from the south, since they're kind of right there in the middle, or maybe a combination of both.
Yeah, they had trade connections to lots of other places, but only minimal during this classic period. In other words, they certainly knew about the people in the Jemez area. They knew about the people on the Pajarito Plateau, because we have some trade pottery. We have trade pottery actually as far west as Hopi, although minimally, because that's like 300 miles away. But that doesn't answer the question of where the original population came from. As far as we know, if you go back before the classic period, there were pit house villages, not above ground structures, but structures of communities of subterranean pit houses, all the way from the developmental into the coalition. The coalition is basically P3, 900 to 1100, 1100 to 1300. So that people were living in the area of the Middle Rio Grande, and several sites have been excavated. They're not easy to find, and unfortunately are prey to bulldozers. Before, I should mention that actually a couple of years ago, when they were widening 550, the bulldozers ran into a pit house village right at the edge of Kuaua, right in Bernalillo. So, and the pottery showed that people were living in that village around 1200-ish, 11, I don't remember the exact dates. They got some absolute dates on that. I'm going to say mid 1100s to 1200. So this was right before the big above ground stuff was built at Kuaua. So the bottom line is that there were people living in the area in pit house villages for several hundred years before the big classic sites were built. So I think there was an indigenous population in situ for a long time.
Yeah, around the river, you would think so. Like for 5 or 10,000 years, right? Anyone else have any other questions? You can turn on your mic and ask the question if you want to. There aren't very many of us here. You know, I had a question about, you were talking about post-colonial ceramics, and Dean, you know, had been studying that when the Spanish came to Santa Fe area, that had the indigenous people making flower pots for them, long story short. And that a lot of forms changed. And it seems like, you know, with this early Spanish contact, and that even the early Spanish were collecting pottery. They were collecting indigenous pottery. But it seems like the contact with the Spanish would have changed the form of the pottery somewhat, you know.
It did. Even at Kuaua, which has an end date, I think, of 1680. I mean, there's no evidence that people continuously occupied that site, you know, after the revolt. After 1700, matte painted pottery, the glazeware was gone, started a whole new series of types and traditions, particularly in the Santa Fe area north. These types, Tewa polychrome, for example, starting at, you know, after the Reconquest, were all matte painted. They were not glaze painted. And many of the vessel forms, as you mentioned, were heavily influenced by European shapes. And of course, that series goes all the way up to the historic Pueblo pottery of the Northern Rio Grande today. So, but there's no evidence that people ever came back and occupied Kuaua ruins after that. So that's a whole different series after.
Right. Okay. Well,
Is it okay? Is it okay to ask another question?
sure, go right ahead.
Of course.
Okay, I'm visualizing where the Kuaua Pueblo is, and trying to visualize what relationship there might be between that group, people from that group, and the Zuni and the other pueblos that are a little further down the Rio Grande. You know, was there any? Did they exist at the same time? Was there interaction?
Well, the Rio Grande Pueblos did have trade contacts. We know this from imported ceramics to the Zuni, the Hopi, the Western Pueblos. Although, judging by the paucity of trade ceramics from that area, I would not say that Kuaua had a very intense relationship with people outside of the Middle Rio Grande region. I mean, pottery doesn't equal people necessarily. If you go and look at the studies that were done at Pottery Mound, which is a little bit farther south and a little bit farther west, kind of on the cusp of that, there's pottery there from all over the Western Pueblos. There's pottery there in quantity that came from 235 miles away from Second Mesa. So trade in pottery over a long space is certainly a phenomenon that we're familiar with in the Southwest, but I can't really verify that a lot of it got to Kuaua for whatever reason. It's almost all indigenous, locally made. I'm not saying it was all the glazeware was made at Kuaua, but it was certainly made within the vicinity in the broader Rio Grande Valley area. And it's hard to trace that because folks were making pottery in lockstep, glaze A, glaze B, glaze C, and so forth, in close connection. We don't like that because it makes it difficult for us to determine whether there was trade for 10 miles, 20 miles, and so forth within the middle Rio Grande, because everybody was looking at each other and making essentially the same type of pottery over the entire Classic period. So it makes it difficult for us to trace. It has to be done based on temper and paste materials, as I was mentioning earlier, construction materials, which may have differed because everybody was in lockstep as far as the decorations were concerned locally. But in a nutshell, Kuaua specifically, I can't see a whole lot of evidence for continuous large-scale ceramic trade outside of the middle Rio Grande. The Jemez is there, and we got a little bit. The Pajarito Plateau is there, and we got a little bit. But quantitatively, these guys are pretty much doing their own thing. Other questions?
Anything else from anyone? Well, by the Classic period, those trade routes were pretty well developed. You know, they probably didn't have to go very far, right?
Right.
Everything was coming to them, and they just stayed in one place by the river.
And of course, if you get a piece of Hopi pottery and it came down the line, it probably came through someplace like Pottery Mound. It didn't come directly from Hopi anyway. Hopi pottery was and is beautiful stuff, and I think highly valued as trade items, even prehistorically. Jedito and that type of pottery was traded very, very widely. I can imagine certain pieces coming through Pottery Mound as a intermediate trade center, and from there into the Rio Grande and up to Bernalillo. But that's a really long ways from the Hopi mesas.
Yeah,
We don't have much.
there's just a few exotics. They might even be curated, you know, and collected. And when there's only one or two that show
Yeah.
up, it's hard to say.
Yeah, right. Right.
Like
Exactly.
they never had a whole plot. So
This was something you put on your mantelpiece, right?
yeah,
It
right.
might have had more value, possibly.
Sure. They thought it was beautiful as well, I'm sure. Okay, any other
Hopi
for anyone? We
folks
kind of
make
went,
beautiful pottery is made at Hopi even today. And the revival of Hopi pottery by Nampeo years ago brought Hopi pottery back to a very high level of manufacture. If you go to the Hopi mesas today, you can buy beautiful Hopi pottery, and it's also, I think, high-end price-wise. Hopi pottery is not cheap. It's been valuable for a long time.
right, forever. Okay, well, thanks everybody for joining us. So remember, our next talk will be March 8th, right away, in just a couple of weeks. So you'll be seeing that on the website. And also you'll be getting an email about the next talk, of course. So
Yeah, keep me in the loop if you would.
I will. I'll put you on the list. So thank you very much for the presentation. That was great. And I learned a lot myself for sure. Everybody did, I'm sure. So everyone take care and be safe and hang in there. We're getting almost to begin to start to get towards the end of this pandemic. So take care and be safe. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Nice to see you.
Thank you.